Sounds True presents Being True. What matters most in work, life, and love? With the founder and publisher of Sounds True. Hey, that's me, Tami Simon. I want to begin with an offering. I've been teaching meditation, somatic meditation, for the past decade, and I love to begin every meditation retreat, every meditation training program with an offering. And in a sense, even though this is not a meditation retreat, it is a deep dive that we're taking together. We're going into the depths of our own heart and our own experience. And to begin with offering means that we take everything in us, our blood, our bones, our life to this moment, our pain, our accomplishment, our losses. We take it all and we offer it up, out, down, 360 degrees. The hand gesture that goes with offering, in my experience, is that our hands are open. It's like our hands are lying flat, completely unfisted, unclenched. There's a sense of total openness to receive. We're not holding on to anything from our past. We're not holding on to any beliefs. We're not holding on to any way the future has to unfold. We're open. We let it all go. And we offer to the forces that are bigger than our small self, that are bigger than what we know. The unlimited forces of love and beauty and creation. And we enter a dialogue, a receiving with those forces. And they receive our life like fertilizer. It nourishes the unseen world when we offer up everything that we are. So I begin being true. Palms completely open, holding on to nothing. When I was 16 years old, I read this sentence in the beginning of a book by Hermann Hesse called Demian. I only wanted to live according to the promptings of my true heart. Why was that so very difficult? Now, interestingly, I read this sentence, as I mentioned, when I was 16 years old. And just recently, I thought I should go back and check and see, is that really the way the book begins, or is that just what was emblazoned in my memory? And in fact, that's really the way the book begins. 35 years later, this sentence, which I'd never referred to again, stuck inside me, in my craw. It stuck inside the center of my heart. I only wanted to live according to the promptings of my true heart. Why was that so very difficult? And I have to say, I have been incredibly blessed, and at the same time, living according to the promptings of the true heart has been quite an arduous journey. Why is it such an arduous journey? Well, I don't know about why it's so hard for other people, but I can tell you why it's been hard for me. It's been hard to live according to the promptings of my true heart because many, many, many times I have not found myself reflected in the culture at large. In many ways, I didn't find myself reflected in terms of my sexuality, in terms of who I was drawn to, the natural erotic flow in me, and at the time, what the culture said was acceptable. I didn't find the culture reflecting me in terms of my interests and what I cared about. The most important thing to me as a young person was to talk about what happens when we die. I just needed to talk about it. And a lot of what I had reflected back to me was, can we not talk about this at the dinner table, please? My own interest in direct experiential learning, not in academic learning, not in reading what other people thought about other people's ideas, and then taking what other people thought and writing an abstract paper about that. That never interested me, not deeply. What I was always interested in, and what I continue to be interested in, is a path of direct revelation. That path, not a path that is often confirmed in most schools of scholarship. So many times, if I looked out, I couldn't find what it meant to be true to myself, to live according to the promptings of my true heart. And I found myself an outsider. And that's why it was so hard. It's hard to be an outsider. And in many ways, I think the roots of Sounds True, which is something that I want to talk about here on this program, being true. Isn't it great how it all goes together? Well, it has to do with this idea of what is true, and that this is something that we only find deep in the promptings of our own heart. And what is deeply true for me very well will not be what is the same for you. That's the whole point. The whole point about being true is that it's completely an inside job. Completely comes from your own depths. It doesn't come from mirroring the world, mirroring your parents, something we all did in order to survive in our families and be accepted. It doesn't come from mirroring the educational environment in which we received our training. It doesn't come from mirroring the business world, which by all accounts traditionally is insane, stepping over people in the name of corporate greed, lying, and basically trespassing the basic ethos of being a decent person. It comes from something inside, deep inside you, and deep inside me. And something, if we give ourselves to it, in my experience, requires quite a lot of sacrifice, sacrificing often the approval of other people, particularly the approval of people we love and we want to please. We want to make them happy. We care about them. Oh no, we're going to disappoint them. We are. If we're going to be true, at least what I see is people who felt, at least at the time, disappointed by some of my decisions. It wasn't what they wanted, but I had to do it. And dare I say, if each of us are going to do it, live according to the promptings of our true heart, we have to have that willingness to disappoint others, to even be criticized by others, and to stand on our own when the culture doesn't reflect us. I was talking to a friend of mine about this Being True recording project, and he shared with me a quote from the Bhagavad Gita that I thought was tremendously meaningful. Krishna says, it's better to live your own dharma, however imperfectly, than to live others perfectly. It's better to live your own life, however imperfectly. And that's part of why I think it's so terrifying, at least for me. It's so terrifying. It's so imperfect. There's no one to model myself after. There's no way to stay in that straight and narrow framework and say, good job, you did it perfectly. You did it right like I told you to. There's no one telling you to. Therefore, it's inherently rough on the edges, imperfect. Yet it's better to live our own dharma, our own life, our own calling, our own destiny, however imperfectly, than to take someone else's and dot the I and cross the T. So here we are, imperfectly moving into the territory of being true. So that's what we'll be exploring together. We'll look at, first of all, what are some of the important points about what we could call this process of being true. And I want to talk some about the origin of Sounds True, the business, and how that was such a leap for me into being an authentic person. You could say an individuated person. What a leap that was 30 years ago. I also want to talk about what it might mean to be true at work and how we can create workplaces that foster authenticity and love and real connection and contribution. I also want to share in this program what I've learned about being true as what we could call a spiritual explorer. Sounds True has now been in existence for 30 years, and we've produced over 1,500 programs. I think I've interviewed more than 500 spiritual teachers, and I've taken in a lot. And in this program on being true, I want to share with you some of what I've learned. And I talk about it as being a spiritual explorer instead of being a spiritual seeker, because I realized early on I didn't like that term, seeker. It implied something missing. There's something I don't have. And I actually don't feel that way. What I feel is that there is no end to exploration, that it's an incredible inner universe, spiritual universe, endless, boundless universe that we live in, and that being an explorer of that universe is my great joy. So I want to share with you some of what I've learned about being true as, we could say, an intrepid spiritual explorer. I also want to talk about being true in love and share with you a contemplation that you can do that's a deathbed contemplation. But the good news is you do not have to be on the verge of dying. Although in a sense, we all don't know when we'll die, which is why there's so much value in doing a deathbed contemplation now while we can. So let's get started. I want to begin by talking about what being true means to me, and 5 main aspects, you could say, are points about the process of being true. The first point, and I think it's one of the most important, and in many ways, if you don't get anything else out of this program, I hope that this sinks deep. There's actually only one of you. There's only one of me. Seth Godin, a writer and cultural visionary, calls this the special snowflakes idea. And you can think about it in a very light way. We're all special snowflakes. Great. Okay, check the box. Move on. Of course, I know that. No big deal. Everybody knows that. We're all special snowflakes. But what I would encourage is that we take a moment to really feel into the fact that our life, and this is a phrase now that I learned from Reggie Ray, who's the meditation teacher that I've studied with for the past 14 years. There's only one, here's the phrase, unprecedented life. Your unprecedented life. You have never been here before. I have never been here before. Okay, you might think, well, yeah, past life is this or that, but you've never been here in this body, in this time-space configuration, in this relationship with this group of people and this need on the planet, this evolutionary time, not with your particular unique DNA, not with your fingerprint. You've never been here before. This is it. Your one unprecedented life. So why does that matter so much? It matters so much to me because that's part of why we can't look outside of ourselves for the recipe about who we are and what we're supposed to become. Because anybody who's talking to us is coming from their experience, not ours. They can't be coming from ours because we're the only single point of light that's us. So we can't copy ourselves after anybody, not any great spiritual teacher, no matter how enlightened they are, no matter how wise they are, no matter how perfected they are. At the end of the day, they're still not us. Adyashanti, a spiritual teacher whom I deeply admire, in a book, The Way of Liberation, has an instruction which is to never give your authority completely to another person. And I think this is such an important idea. We can't give our authority away to anyone because ultimately we can learn from people tremendously. We can receive incredible gifts. But at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, the beginning of the day when we step out of our bed onto our 2 feet, and at the end of the day when we put our head, our one head, with our particular hair that has our special DNA in it, it's our head that hits the pillow. So at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, we're the one, we're the arbiter of our life, of what's needed, of what's called for. And so if we really get it, there's just one of us, and our life is unprecedented, then we know that we have to get our ultimate instructions from the inside. They have to bubble up. They have to emerge from what we could call our true heart. And our true heart, yes, connected to our physical heart, but it's also that sense of heart knowing bubbles up in us. It comes from inside. And I'm emphasizing this point because I think when I was a young person, I honestly was looking for somebody to tell me what the heck was going on. I really was. I thought, I'll find a book. I'll read lots of books. Those books will tell me. They'll tell me how to live my life, right? I'll find some prescription someplace. That will tell me. I'll find a teacher. I'll find the most enlightened people on the planet. They'll tell me. And at a certain point, I got it. I could learn lots of skills and be inspired by many different ideas, but those skills all pointed one place, and those ideas all pointed one place, and that place was to my own inner process, my own inner knowing, my own heart knowing. And at the end of the day, I had to follow that, even if it didn't look like what the great spiritual teachers of our time were saying, even if it contradicted other people, even the great enlightened masters. So we have to find our own way. We can't follow a recipe or a prescription in an ultimate sense. Which brings us now to the second point. How do we do it? We jump into the darkness. We go into the darkness to receive our instructions. And in many ways, I think that's what spiritual practices, good spiritual practices, teach us how to do. Adyashanti also has this quote that I love: a good spiritual teaching doesn't give you answers, it questions your answers. So we go into the unknown. That's the only place that our own knowing can come from if it's not a regurgitation of other people's ideas. It's not going to come from the outside. It's not going to come from the books you read. It's not going to come from the audios you buy from Sounds True. Ultimately, all of that material gives you the confidence and the know-how to drop deeply into the unknown. And that's a huge surrender. And dare I say, it's a somatic surrender. It has to be for it to be real. And what I mean by a somatic surrender is there's a letting go in a felt way throughout our whole body and being. It's like a melting away, letting all of our thoughts melt, letting every constructed sense of everything melt, a complete dropping. We could say it is a open entry into voidness, a willingness to be in the void and to let ourselves fall through the gaps. And there are so many natural gaps. The big challenge is that we're terrified. We're all terrified. The gap is terrifying. At least most people are terrified, in my experience. I'm terrified. Have been. So when we see a gap, we get busy. We do something. God knows we do something. It's a great time to do the dishes or get on email or watch television or open the refrigerator or let's do something. There's a gap. Oh, my holy God. But actually, I think in order to get the instructions that are unique for our life, that come from our own deep knowing, we have to go into that darkness. And in fact, I think what a good meditation practice can train us in is when those gaps emerge, we fall into them. We start not following our traditional habit pattern to get busy at all cost, but instead there's a welcome. Robert Augustus Masters calls it not avoiding the void. I like that phrase, it's memorable. Instead of avoiding the void, we fall into it. We know that's where the richness of our life comes from. And as John Wellwood says, it's a fertile void. It's fertile. It holds our life. I think part of the reason more people aren't wildly original, and I love this word original, coming from the origin, that dark, unknown source. Why we don't experience more originality is because we don't spend enough time at the point of origin. We don't hang out there long enough. Sometimes I've thought that the great comedians and humorists, they were people who must spend time in the darkness, because that's how they're able to come with such a strange curveball that just knocks you back laughing. It's just from left frickin' field. They're not out there mimicking. It's so fresh. It's so never before seen. Comes from the darkness. And I often think the big challenge with being true, Clarissa Pinkola Estes talks about original voice, about coming into our original voice. It's our unwillingness to spend time in that void space. So I actually see that as a requirement of a being true process, because otherwise it's just our constructed sense of self, our ego that's saying, I'm going to do something no one's ever done and watch this thing. And it has a certain feel to it. And it feels like the person wanting to get attention and be confirmed by others in how special and unique they are. That's different than what I'm talking about. When something comes from darkness, it has a certain feel to it. And in many ways, I think that's intuitively what I meant by the term sounds true when I started Sounds True. That there was this sense that you can hear in the voice, you can feel it in the humor, you can sense it in the art, that there is the fresh air of unprecedentedness in what feels like it comes from darkness. It wakes you up. You don't feel like you're receiving something that's been shoveled around again and again and again. And quite honestly, when Sounds True receives submissions for book projects, that's always what I'm looking for. Could there just please be a waft of fresh air coming off the page? Could there be something that feels like, wow, this person went underneath and came up with their own communication from boundless space? It's fresh. It's original. So the first point, there's only one of you. And the second, this one of you can only know its true original operating instructions, if you will, if there is a willingness to go beyond whatever fear there might be, drop through the crack in the world, the space that's there, and it's always there. It's there when you wake up, before you have your first cup of coffee. There's a strange openness. Nothing there. That kind of space. It's a natural space. You don't even have to make it up. It's just there. It's there in between thoughts. They do slow down if you let them. And there is a gap. And you can let yourself not just fall into the gap, but spend a lot of time there. And then see what emerges. Which brings us to the third point I want to make about being true. Again and again, we see that our true life, our authentic life, comes from open space. And what I find so interesting is that there is a natural birthing process, if you will, that space gives birth through us to what we could call an imperative, the next imperative in our life. What's needed? You could say what's called for. It's so interesting. Here's this emptiness, nothing going on. Oh my God. We stay with it. It goes from being absolutely terrifying to actually being quite interesting, maybe even enjoyable or blissful. And a birthing occurs. This is my experience. A birthing occurs. And the birthing is, you know what's really needed? This is what's really needed. You could say we're receiving guidance. I remember Carolyn Mace saying, everybody is receiving guidance all the time. There's no big secret to receiving guidance. It's not a big, difficult thing. The challenge is actually following through on the guidance we receive. So let's break it down a little bit. If guidance is always coming to us from the darkness of space, it's coming. The first question is, can we receive it? Can we listen? And again, I think that's what spiritual practice helps us with. It helps attune us to our inner ears and our inner eye, and that sense of knowing, inner knowing, that's different than the repetitive thoughts that are rolling around in our head again and again and again. There's a different feel to it, and that's what I really want to emphasize. You can think of receiving guidance as primary knowing. There's something primary about it. Have you ever heard people talk about, oh, I got a download? And it almost feels like something's being poured in through the top of your head. Oh, something just got downloaded right through the top of my head and it fell right in. Or that 3 a.m. feeling. You're in bed and something comes and it's a type of knowing. You just know. You know the solution to a project. So receiving guidance has to do with learning to tune in more and more and more to what's primary. I myself feel so grateful for the years of somatic meditation training that I've received, because again and again we're brought into the body. Reggie Ray says that the body is the organ of egoless wisdom. I love that. It's the organ of egoless wisdom. It's the knowing that isn't filtered through our conceptual framework. It's non-conceptual knowing. It's that gut knowing, that gut instinct. Don't do it. Don't go into business with that person. Don't do it. Or do it. that kind of gut knowing. It's that heart knowing that says, I know this person doesn't look like what I thought my next lover was going to look like. Nothing like them. In fact, they're not even the same gender I thought my next lover was going to be. It could be that weird. But your heart knows. Your heart knows. That kind of knowing. That's the kind of receipt of guidance that I'm talking about. Again, spiritual practices train us to take the thinking mind and let it work on second order analysis, but allow us to drop into a primary way before we begin to even think about it, which is so direct and incontrovertible, indisputable. Nobody can dispute it when you love like that. Your body knows it's the source of egoless wisdom. Now, as I mentioned, Carolyn Myss had this great saying, everybody receives guidance, but the challenge is, can you actually do it? Can you step into it? And this brings us to the fourth point I want to make. Do each of us have the courage in our life? And I do think it's courage to follow the instructions that we're given, to be brave. I love Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's concept of warriorship. The warrior is someone who doesn't have anything to defend. So we're not coming from defending any territory, but instead we're coming from our genuine heart. And to come from our genuine heart in our life, in my experience, takes incredible bravery. It's the bravery to take the next step. And believe me, we don't need to be fearless to be a brave warrior. In fact, if we wait to be fearless, we might never take a step. We can't wait for some mythic state of fearlessness. We have whatever level of fear we have about other people's reactions, responses, whether or not this is really going to work. And we step anyway. We do it. And we don't have to take 20 steps. We just have to take the next step. One step. With whatever level of fear we have, stripped down and undefended, exposed, vulnerable, true to our hearts, genuine. And then the fifth point I want to highlight in being true is we let the phenomenal world play. We let it play out. We're in dialogue with the whole world. We take a step. What comes back? Let's see. Let's see what comes back. It's letting the karma of the situation unfold. That's a way to put it. Let's see what happens. Let's see what's wanted. Let's see how that step that we took is received. Let's re-enter the darkness and see what's coming at us and take one more step and then see again. Let's take one more step. Oh, let's walk not forward. Look what the universe brought. Let's go to the left. There's a path that's open that way. Oh, it's left, left, left. Oh, wait, hold on, pause. Back into total darkness. What is born? What emerges? Trusting reality to give us the feedback we need each step of the way, not caught in some big conceptual dream of the ultimate goal, often that's so filled with hubris and fantasy, but just the next step, the next step, the next step. It's a conversational relationship, if you will, with all of creation. Just like if you were dialoguing with somebody, you wouldn't talk for 5,000 hours. You would say a few things and then you'd get some feedback and you'd listen. You'd hear the response. You'd take it in. And then you would say something. That kind of dialogical relationship with the world, where that embedded in the world as a sacred world, as a sacred expression of life. And each step we take, we get feedback, we take it in, we go back into the darkness, and we let the birthing process then speak and work through us as we take another step. Obviously, being true is not programmatic. It's not linear. It's the natural unfolding of our, you could say, authentic self, or a phrase that Reggie Ray uses that I love, our true person. Our true person. It's coming into our true personhood. And for each one of us, it happens through the soil of our life, from the soil of our life. We're born from the stories of our life, from the crossroads of our life, from those points of going left, right, and which is the one that is really going to lead to our true personhood. And can we do it? Can we take the step in the direction of that authenticity? For me, the biggest initiation into coming into my own true personhood was in my early 20s, when I had dropped out of college, and the entire sequence of events that led to the founding of Sounds True. And so I want to share that with you, the origin story of Sounds True, and to see what we can all learn about this process from one story, because I think it's like that. Whenever we delve deeply into any one of our stories of the birth of true personhood, we find universal lessons. For me, the story of Sounds True begins actually in despair. A despair of not knowing if I would fit into the world in any way, if I had a place here. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I got into such a despairing situation as a 21-year-old. I went to Swarthmore College thinking that I would be a philosophy major. I wanted to understand the meaning of life. Philosophy, right? But I soon found myself in the religion department, where I had the opportunity to study the lives and teachings of the great mystics. Oh, that will help me find the meaning of life. But at a certain point, it became apparent to me that any mystic really worth their salt wouldn't get a degree in mysticism, writing about the lives of other mystics. They would go out and do it. And so I left Swarthmore at the end of my sophomore year, and I went to Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal for a year. And during that time, I discovered the practice of meditation. It was a huge discovery for me. It was the first time that I was ever introduced to a way of quieting the discursive mind and really being with my greater self, expanded self. And it felt like a homecoming to me, an ancient homecoming. And I made a promise. I made a promise as I traveled to temples in India and Nepal. I made a promise that I would do anything I could, anything in my power to bring these types of practices, meditation or other kinds of practices, that gave people a doorway into the inner vastness. I would do anything. I have an image of myself flat out, face down in the ground, arms outstretched, lying flat in a prostration, temple after temple, full moon ceremony after full moon ceremony, giving myself to that promise. Universe, please use me in some way to bring these teachings to the best of my ability to as many people as possible. And I want to take a pause there and ask you, is there any promise in you, ancient promise, something buried in you, a promise perhaps that you made at another time in your life when you discovered something that meant a lot to you? Maybe it was poetry, or the taste of good food, or caring for a child, or being part of a political campaign. Something in you where you made a promise, and perhaps it's covered over at this moment, and you could uncover it and let your heart be big enough to receive it. So I made a promise during that trip, but as it turned out, I came back to the United States weighing 90 pounds, far, did I say far? Less than I weigh today. And I had hepatitis from eating food from the street. So I was yellow basically on my skin. And since I'm in a tell-all mode, I was shitting white, which is the reason I knew things were of concern in my physical body. And I wasn't talking. This was really interesting. I wasn't talking much at all. Now, this is quite curious because as a child, I was called Big Mouth by my parents. And so when I came back at age 21, not talking and weighing 90 pounds, of course, there was quite a lot of concern. I wasn't talking because I thought most of what people said, they said in order to fill the space. They were just filling space. Why was everybody so busy filling space? They just couldn't handle it. They were so uncomfortable with silence and openness and emptiness. So I wasn't going to say anything. Well, of course, as I said, this was quite a concern to my family. So I had discovered meditation, but I didn't have the nervous system, the integration, the maturity, if you will, to really work with the depths of what I touched and come back, hit the ground running as an effective human. No, far from it. I came back in a pretty compromised state. At the same time, I tasted something quite real during my travels, and it changed me forever. And this is where the state of despair entered. I came out to Boulder, Colorado, a college dropout. What was I going to do with myself? I thought maybe I would study at Naropa University the psychology of meditation, and I could understand perhaps what happened to me. But I realized I just couldn't pursue an academic path. That wasn't for me. So there I was, waitressing tables. My parents said, if you're not going to get a degree, we don't want to support you. And I thought, well, that makes good sense. Why should they support me? I should support myself. So we're starting to see here this moving away from convention. Of course, what was the conventional expectation was that I would get a college degree. Yeah? I had gone to a very fancy college preparatory high school, gotten into all kinds of fancy colleges and went to Swarthmore, and here I was, not only not graduating, but I was waitressing at a greasy Chinese restaurant. And I was clueless. I was actually clueless. Talk about going into the darkness. I had said no to the expected path, and I didn't know what an alternative path was. That's the gap. I didn't know. I couldn't look my parents straight in the eyes or talk to them on the phone directly and have any kind of explanation for what I was doing. I don't know. And at that time in my life, I started saying a prayer. And the prayer was, God, I'm willing to do your work. Please show me what it is. And at that time in my life, as I said this prayer, I meant it with every single cell in my body. God, I'm willing to do your work. Please show me what it is. And I was willing to mop the floors for real if I thought it was God's work. There wasn't any big dream here. I just wanted to be useful. And I wanted it to be, quote unquote, God's work. And what I meant was that I wanted to serve something greater than myself. And so I would ask you if there's a true prayer in you. Is there a true prayer in you about your unprecedented life, about your expression in the world, unrelated to what anyone else might think? It lives that deep inside you. I remember when someone I really respected, a professor in the religion department, said to me, you know, Tami, just graduate from college to make your parents happy. Look what they've sacrificed for you. They've given so much. They've saved all of this money for you. This is their dream for you. Can't you just do that? It's not that big a deal. You're a decent student. Finish it up and then go drop off the world and explore. Just finish and get your college degree. But something in me knew that I couldn't. And I would ask you that question too. Is there any way in your life where you're wearing a set of clothes that are really someone else's? Or they're too small. Maybe they fit you before, but you outgrew them. They're not your clothes anymore. You burst the seams. And even if other people made sacrifices for you, because that's one of the really hard ones when it comes to bucking convention, I think, is when other people gave for us. And we have such gratitude for them. And even so, we have to do something else. So here I found myself out in Boulder, Colorado. Wasn't going to finish my degree. Couldn't finish it at Swarthmore. and couldn't even get a degree from an alternative university where I could study the psychology of meditation and write about whatever I wanted. I couldn't even do that. It just wasn't right. Waitressing in a greasy Chinese restaurant where the cook smoked cigarettes while he cooked over the wok, and occasionally ashes fell into the wok. People thought it was an interesting spice. They loved his sauces, incidentally. They loved his sauces. Little did they know what the secret ingredients were. And I was saying this prayer again and again and again. God, I'm willing to do your work. Please show me what it is. At a certain point, I stopped waitressing. I just couldn't do it. It was meaningless. And I said to myself, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to go to yoga classes and I'm going to say my prayer and we're going to see what happens. Does something open up in my life? This is the darkness phase, the gap, the despair. And I remember the last entry into my journal was, I guess my experiment has failed. I've run out of the money that I've saved from waitressing and I'm going to have to go get a job. And 24 hours after I wrote that in my journal, I received a call that my father had died of a coronary. And I came back from my father's funeral with a check for $25,000 in my pocket. Not a lot of money, but for me at that age, 21 years old, with zero money, it felt like a whole heck of a lot of money. Now, what was I going to do? I still felt this huge cluelessness. The one thing I had involved myself with in Boulder as a volunteer was public radio. So I volunteered to have an interview show where I would talk to spiritual teachers. And I would interview them about their ideas. And I thought this was a way I could continue with the education that I really wanted, that I wasn't able to get in an academic setting. I could talk to great spiritual teachers and ask them the burning questions that lived in me. And as part of my interview show, I was talking to a gentleman who actually is a very successful entrepreneur in Boulder, Colorado. But at the time, I was interviewing him, believe it or not, about the topic of crystals, because he had these huge crystals in his window, and I would walk by and see the crystals, and I wanted to know, what are you doing with these crystals? What's going on? In preparation for our interview for public radio, I was talking to him just to get an idea of what we were going to talk about on the radio, and I said, I've received this small inheritance. I don't know what to do with it. And then after I came back from my father's funeral, I received additional funds as well and inherited, in the end, something like $75,000. And I said to this gentleman, I don't know what to do with this money. I don't want to put it in the bank. Who knows where banks actually reinvest your money? Remember, I'm a very idealistic 21-year-old at the time. So I said, what should I do with this money? And he said, why don't you invest it in yourself? And when he said that, I thought, well, great idea. Wonderful idea. If only me and myself knew what the heck we wanted to do with ourselves, that would be great. And so I reflected that to him. And he looked at me and he said, Tami, you know what you want to do. Come back in 3 days and we'll talk about it. So I walked out of his office and a very interesting thing happened. I walked out of his office, and as I was walking out of his office, I suddenly felt like I was walking a few feet above the ground. So that was the first really interesting thing. I thought, what's going on? I'm not walking like I normally walk. I'm suspended in space. I'm walking above the ground. This is very strange. And then, and this is a true story, this is being true after all, I heard a voice. And the voice said, disseminate spiritual wisdom. And then I found myself walking on the ground again, feet on the ground. And a rational process kicked in where I started thinking about, well, how is this actually going to happen? How am I going to do it? And I decided that I would start disseminating spiritual wisdom through audio. I already had a radio show. People requested copies. Granted, it was 2 or 3 copies a week at $10 each from my little home dubbing deck. But I thought I'll build on that, and that's how I'll get started. And that's how Sounds True began. And there's a couple points I really want to underscore and pull out, if you will, from this story. One is the role that other people played. This gentleman I met who said, "Why don't you put that money into yourself? You know what you want to do." And I think we can never underestimate the power we have in other people's lives to impact them. In a sense, the prayer that I said, "God, I'm willing to do your work," to me that soaked me in gasoline, if you will, if you'll go along with this metaphor. And when this gentleman said, "You know what you want to do," that was the match, and I combusted. I went up in flames, and I did know. I did know. And so I think we can never underestimate not only the power that we have in other people's lives, by 1 or 2 sentences we might say at just the right time, but also how we can be open to receiving from the phenomenal world, how the universe speaks through other people. It actually does. When we're sincerely asking for direction, when we have a prayer, a true prayer that's deep in us, who knows who's going to come into our life? What page will fall open in a book? What person will knock on our door or call us on the phone and give us just what we need for that next step to happen? I want to make another point about this prayer, this true prayer. God, I'm willing to do your work. Please show me what it is. I mentioned that I was willing to mop floors if need be. But really, what was underneath the prayer in me was a need, you could say, to be of service in some way, to give back to the world that had given me so much. And that was part of the despair that I felt. I felt that I had been given so much in my life. Love from my family, opportunities to travel, incredible educational opportunities. I had been given so much. How was I going to give to the world? What could I possibly give to creation? How could I give back? And I felt that as a burden inside, this need and desire to be of service. And I'm emphasizing that because sometimes, especially in today's world, where there is an emphasis on do what you love, quote, and the money will follow, the emphasis is so much on us beginning this process of being true by identifying our passions. And of course, we need to express ourselves in the world doing something that we love to do. In the beginning of Sounds True, I worked 70, 80 hours a week, and I did it because I loved what I was doing. I loved it. So of course, yes, we need to love what we do. That's the only way we'll bring to it the necessary energy if our heart is deeply engaged. At the same time, I honestly think that's only 49% of the equation, if I can use numbers. I think the majority of the equation is, how can I serve the suffering in the world? How can I help heal the suffering in the world? How can I be living medicine for other people? How can I make a contribution? And really, if we're talking about livelihood, that type of expression, people exchange value for value. I remember giving a talk to a group of graduates of an alternative MBA program, and I said if I were only following my passion, I would have tried to get paid for making out and dancing, 2 things I love to do. But I really don't know how much money I would make from doing either of those 2 things. Certainly questionable. But if we focus instead, where does our passion, what turns us on, where does that actually meet the needs of the world, the suffering of the world, a problem that the world needs solved? Could we use our creativity for that? And can that in some way match our own natural enthusiasm? I believe that nexus, that meeting point, is where the true enterprise comes from. And so I would ask you again, what aspect of the pain of the world moves you? For me, what I was moved by was how people didn't have a connection to the underlying web of wholeness that we're all a part of. My sense was that there was a gap in our education. You could say we didn't have the spiritual education. We didn't have the insight. We hadn't heard enough from the great spiritual teachers of our time to open our eyes and open our hearts to our inherent interconnectedness. And if people knew that, if people had that realization inside of them, I believed that the world would be incredibly different and that we would be able to solve all kinds of social problems. That was the need in the world, the need for spiritual education that deeply moved me. And my passion was and is for broadcasting, for the beauty of the spoken word, for the power of direct communication to awaken something in another person. Disseminate Spiritual Wisdom brought my passion and my sense of what was needed together. So again, I would ask you, what is happening in the world that moves you, that makes you cry out in anguish, wanting to offer some kind of response? And how does that match with your natural gifts? What you would do with yourself if left alone and you had plenty of time on your hands. What I found is that when I'm left alone and I have plenty of time on my hands, believe it or not, I ask a lot of existential questions. My friends will attest to this fact. It's just what happens. Could that natural predilection match the call and cry of the world in some way, such that the output could be valuable? Disseminate spiritual wisdom. That was the gift that came to me, that banner, those 3 words, 30 years ago. I believe that a blessing, a gift, will also come to you through the words of another person, through a dream, through a mysterious voice, through an ad in the newspaper. I believe that our true prayers are answered. The origin story of Sounds True illustrates many of the points I've been trying to bring forward about what we could call the process of becoming a true person and creating expressions in the world that are from that source of origin, that deep source of unknowing in us. A very important point, though, is that this is not something that happens once and then you check off the box. I was at a crossroads. I prayed deeply. I turned left. Done. Great. Good. I'm true for the rest of my life. Yippee, I did it. I'm an authentic person. That's not my experience. My experience is that again and again, are you ready for it? Every day, I am faced with how genuine will I be today? Today, how much empty space will be the root system of my being and the choices that I make? How much will come from vastness instead of reactivity? I remember having a conversation with a very accomplished businesswoman. Her business is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she was talking to me about a process that she had been in for the last several years about questions of purpose and what her purpose is in the world today. And I thought, you've accomplished so much already. But there's no such thing in being a true person that is anything like resting on your laurels. There are no laurels. There is only a call forward, again and again and again, to offer more of ourselves again, to risk yet again, to go into the darkness yet again, and see what's needed now and now and now afresh. Sounds True presents Being True, Session 2, with what's her name? When I began Sounds True in 1985 at the age of 22, it was an experiment. I figured I have enough money for about 2 years to try this thing on. Let's see if it works. And if it doesn't, I'll have to go out and get a job, which is what I'm facing now. And I'm not particularly employable. And in 2 years, I won't be particularly employable either, but I won't be worse off. Not really. I'll have tried this 2-year experiment, and let's see what happens. Let's let it unfold. And I emphasize this idea of experimentation because I think sometimes we have the misconception that if we listen deeply inside and we get an inspiration, we're going to emerge from that dark soup. We're going to pick up the bow and arrow. We're going to pull the bow back. The arrow is released and bullseye, we hit it. And I just don't think it works that way. At least it hasn't worked that way often in my life. Often if the arrow hits the target anywhere on the target, that's great. That's wonderful. Let's try again. Let's adjust. Let's stand a little closer. Let's make the bullseye bigger. Let's breathe differently. You get the point. Recently, I was reading about a local gluten-free bakery because they make a type of French bread that my partner just loves. She loves this French bread. $7.50 a loaf. It's worth every bite. And I was reading about how the gentleman, the baker, developed this French bread. And you ready for this? It took him 200 tries with the recipe before he got gluten-free French bread to be airy and fluffy and to taste the way that gluten-filled French bread can taste. 200 tries. It impressed me when I read that, and I thought I really need to remember that when it comes to the process of bringing forth what we envision and bringing it out into the world. Some people in today's language might call it iteration. We keep iterating. I don't know why people like that word better than experimenting. I like the word experimenting. It reminds me of being a bit like a mad scientist in a lab, trying things out. And Sounds True began as an experiment, and here, 30 years later, I have to tell you, it's still an experiment. Or you could say, we're still iterating. It doesn't end. I think part of that is because we're a multimedia business, and the world of media keeps changing. And part of that is I think that that's the nature of learning. Learning always goes on and continues and bubbles up and is frothy and is filled with new life and new forms and new possibilities. Let's track back now 30 years to the beginning of Sounds True. It began with just me and a tape recorder. Now we have about 100 employees. Here I am with my tape recorder, recording conferences, editing those recordings, and beginning to put them into a catalog. And soon after the company was launched, the local newspaper, the Boulder Daily Camera, decided to do a story on what was this young woman up to at Sounds True. After they interviewed me, they said the story was going to come out in the weekend paper. Got the paper, looked in the paper, couldn't find the article anywhere. Looked through the whole paper again, couldn't find the article. Here was the curious thing. It was in the business section. But I didn't think at that point, I think I was about 25 years of age, I didn't even think to look in the business section. I was looking in the lively arts section. I was looking in the front part of the paper. I didn't even think at the time of Sounds True as a business. And I want to talk about that because at the time I thought that business was actually not just a dirty word, but a dirty industry, a dirty thing to do with one's life. I thought that business was basically about personal greed. That's why people went into business. It's the last thing on my mind when I started Sounds True. I wanted to be of service. I wanted to use the power of art and disseminating spiritual wisdom, the great truths of the perennial traditions. What did that have to do with business? It didn't have anything to do with business, but there Sounds True was in the business section. And what I realized at that time and what I carry with me now is an incredible call to think about business differently. That business does not actually need to be and shouldn't be something for personal greed. Business can actually be an expression of our human longing to both express ourselves and contribute to the welfare of other people, and to solve a social problem. People call this today social entrepreneurship, and it's great. We can give it a fancy name, but why can't business be about solving the problems of society? People need to eat, people need to thrive, People need things for their homes. People need so many things. Our community, where we live, the people whose lives we touch all over the world now, they need things. Why can't business be about solving those needs, serving those needs? Simultaneously, it can be about our experience as individuals working with each other. You ready for this? To open our hearts and grow. To grow in community with other people. Now, I have a sensitivity that as I talk about what business means to me, that I'll be criticized. I'll be criticized as naive, as running that small little shop in Boulder, Colorado in some weird Boulder bubble. So I'm sensitive to that. And yet, I also think being true in our work life, for me, means saying, you ready for this? Hey, dominant culture, you're destroying the world, actually. You're destroying the environment. You're destroying the lives of families where men and women don't have time at work to actually care for their children and to have balanced lives. You're turning people into greed machines. Hey, dominant culture, who might look at the Sounds True experiment as some strange, naive young woman who's no longer a young woman in Boulder, Colorado, in a little bubble. I want to say there is a way to do things differently. And that for me, it was never about learning to play the game of business. It was about reinventing the game. No, I don't accept that game. There's another way to be sustainable, and more than being sustainable, to thrive, to make money. You ready for this? I like money. I really like it. I like the independence it gives me, the freedom it gives me. I like the quality of artistic ingredients that it enables, Sounds True, as a multimedia business to work with. But I have to tell you, there are things that I like so much more than money. So many things. I could talk to you for hours about what they are. The feeling of the breeze. My partner's hand when she holds my hand. The smile on the face of someone at Sounds True. The brightness of someone's eyes. I could go on and on. And so in the way that I look at business, money is a requirement, of course, to make a business healthy and strong. And I'm so happy that Sounds True is healthy and strong. But it is not a reason to be in business. It is not the bow of the boat. What I mean by the bow of the boat is what comes first. And I think if we place what comes first, first, and for me, what has always come first at Sounds True is both the mission of what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and how we treat each other and all of the people that we come into contact with, and the ideas themselves that we publish, how we actually honor and treat the actual ideas. Those things come first. And then there's money also. And from the very beginning, I articulated this idea, really at first to myself, and then to the employees who were drawn to work at Sounds True with me. I articulated this idea as having 3 multiple bottom lines. That here at Sounds True, we have 3 bottom lines. That means that we're always managing to be successful to these 3 bottom lines. And so I want to further articulate this a bit because it's been so important and has remained a touchstone here at Sounds True for really what is our core ethos. So our first bottom line is our mission: disseminate spiritual wisdom. There's a lot of ideas in the spiritual marketplace that promise quick this, simple that, enlightenment in 2 easy, prescriptive steps, and no more pain, no more struggle, just bliss, no sensitivity to what's happening in the world, no mention that your heart might actually break if it was open enough to tune in to the life of other people. There's a lot of information like that in the spiritual marketplace, and I have to tell you, it sells. But to me, that's not spiritual wisdom. That's not what the mystics stood for when they were willing to risk their lives for what they cared the most about. That's something else. That's not the mission of Sounds True. And so for me to say that our mission is a bottom line, it means that despite the seductions of giving people what they want, we want to present the depth, the promise, the glory, and the real sacrifice, and the real heartbreak, the heart-opening path that is the true path, in my view, of moving into the depth of what spiritual wisdom can really bring into our life, the kind of generosity, tenderheartedness that it can bring. So we manage to our mission despite the seductions of the marketplace. That's our first bottom line. Our second bottom line, sometimes I call it, and this is corny, but it means something to me, I call it our love bottom line. It's our culture. It's the set of relationships here at Sounds True. It's the way we interact every day with each other. One of the big insights that I had early on, and it's been a touchstone for me throughout my entire business career, is that means and ends are the same. Early on, what I saw was people who were running businesses that sold spiritually based products of different kinds, but somehow thought it was okay to squeeze every nickel and dime out of their vendors. We can make more money if we push our vendors into the corner and squeeze them. That's what business is about, right? And then we're going to sell a product on yoga breathing. No. That's the idea of means and ends being the same thing. And I believe this deep in my core. If we want a world where people are kind to each other, then each day we have to be kind to each other. If we're going to publish programs that introduce people to the power of the present moment, then here at Sounds True, we're going to have to find a way in our busy workday where there's a lot to do, and there is a lot to do, we're going to have to find a way to appreciate and savor and relish the present moment. We have to do it. We have to have the process of our work be congruent with the products. It's an aspiration we have to keep coming back to again and again and again. And this is all wrapped up in Sounds True's second bottom line, the love bottom line, our culture, how we operate, the how of how we go about our work every day, how we relate to our customers, our vendors that I mentioned, how we relate to each other, how we relate to our investor, how we relate to ourselves, the sum total of all of our relationships. And then our third bottom line is, you guessed it, we have to be profitable. We need to be profitable as a business. Otherwise, we can't continue to fulfill our first two bottom lines. I once heard this phrase, no margin, no mission. And I like that. No margin, no mission. No margin, and we can't continue. And we can't thrive. We can't have, as I mentioned, all of those creative ingredients. I think about it as a painter and wanting to have a fine color blue or a fine yellow or a fine purple. I want to paint with those fine colors. And sure, there are some years here at Sounds True where our belt has been tight and we've painted with dust. There have been a couple years like that in our 30 years. And there are other years where we've had incredible ingredients to work with. And so, believe it or not, of all three bottom lines, the profit bottom line is the one that has the most laxity. It has the most range. We have to be profitable. You know, a couple years we weren't. Guess what? We were profitable the years before, and we stored some money away, and we were okay. We weathered the storm. That works. There's room in the profit bottom line. But overall, year after year after year, taken as a whole, yes, we have to be profitable. And we manage to that. We think intelligently about that. We plan towards that. We're careful and conservative so that that's the case. Interestingly, though, the third bottom line, this profit bottom line, there's room. In the first two, there's a lot less room. If we're not true to our mission, you ready for this? I don't want to come to work. I can't do it. I won't do it. And if we don't treat each other well, I won't come to work either. I don't want to be here. It's too painful. It's too terrible. It actually hurts. And it's a betrayal of what, quote unquote, sounds true.